I once said I'd like to have been a guillemot. I was passionate about them. The longer you go, the more you find out, and you still see new things. The situation I'm in now with this project is a bit like the situation that collectors find themselves in. People that accumulate huge collections of books, they don't want to see that collection broken up. I recently gave a talk about the long-term Skomer study. The first question was, how do you keep going when things are looking so bleak? But the bottom line is you have to keep going, because if we go, well, I'm just giving up, then you have no chance of improving things. I'd always wanted to be on island. When I was 11, my dad took me to Bardsey Island. That was just exhilarating. And lots of different birds around, the weather was perfect. As we walked back to the boat at the end of the day, we passed a young man with a telescope on a tripod with his notebook open in his lap. My dad nudged me and he said, "You could do something like that when you're older." That was it. The seed was sown. I'm amazed looking back that he ever imagined that a career to do with birds could ever be viable. I mean, it wasn't then. As it happened, things changed dramatically. Auks, guillemots, razorbills and puffins had been declining, it appeared, in southern Britain. David Lack, the 20th century's greatest ornithologist, had a plan to try to get a student on each of those three species to try to figure out why these declines were occurring. I just finished my finals exams at Newcastle and persuaded my dad to drive me down to Pembrokeshire. And I hadn't ever been to Skomer before, but the day was perfect, the sea was flat calm, and I was absolutely on a high. I was so excited. As you approach Skomer, you can smell the seabird droppings. For me, it's fabulous. The air is thick with the smell of basically digested fish. That's the first indication that you get that you're somewhere special. As you move to the cliff edge and you become adjacent to a seabird colony, guillemot colony, the chorus of sounds that come from the guillemots is fantastic. It sets my heart racing. It's just a wonderful, evocative sound. I actually made a few notes about my very first day on Skomer. It's the 11th of June, 1972. A fine, clear morning, and I managed to get the second boat over to Skomer. My father left about 11 a.m. Quite an incredible island, abounding with auks, gulls, rabbits, voles, short-eared owls, etc. I looked around and saw some of the guillemot colonies where I'm going to be working. The colony that had been chosen for me to work at was called Bull Hole. That became my favourite place. But the beauty of it was you could walk down a fairly steep grassy slope and be opposite the cliffs where the birds were. On first arrival, you really just want to absorb a sense of how the colony feels. And if you look at some of these groups here, you can see that the birds are literally shoulder to shoulder in physical contact with each other. And there's almost no other bird that breeds like that. So this is one of the things that makes guillemots unique and interesting. Studying guillemots is a bit like going to the cinema. You get into your hide, open the window, and then everything is happening directly in front of you. At that time, I knew nothing about guillemots. Having got some photographs of one of the main colonies on Skomer taken in the 1930s, I realised that the population then had probably been at least 100,000. And in the 1970s, guillemot population on Skomer was probably at its lowest ebb, about 2,000 pairs, so massive, massive decline. One of the parameters that you have to measure if you want to understand how populations work is the breeding success. Now, guillemots breed on open ledges with no nest, just flat rock. You hardly ever see their egg because they cover it up when they're incubating, so it's quite difficult to measure breeding success. You use your binoculars or a telescope and you map the colony and you follow the fate of each egg without disturbing the birds, and then you will get a true measure of breeding success. But we also caught some guillemots and put some rings on them. By doing that, you can measure their survival by looking at the proportion of ringed birds that survive from one year to the next. So I wrote everything down in notebooks. It sort of dawned on me that a 3-year PhD was completely hopeless for figuring out the population dynamics of a bird that can live for 40 years. But I decided to keep going back because I'd invested 4 breeding seasons there and I was kind of in love with guillemots. I loved teaching. I'd done a lot of teaching as a PhD student in Oxford, and so I was dead keen. I was able to carry on doing stuff on Skomer. Then in the early 1980s, Skomer guillemot population was starting to increase rather than decrease. Nobody knew why. I thought, right, this is now where we just change gear and make this into a long-term study. We tried to raise the money to employ a field assistant, and they would follow a set protocol to measure survival and breeding success and timing of breeding, and we stuck to the same methodology year after year. And every few years we'd check to see whether we had enough data to try to construct a population model, and it took 30 years. And what that meant was that the population was controlled by intrinsic factors. It was the number of chicks produced by the Skomer guillemots themselves, it was the survival rate of the Skomer adults and the survival rate of the juveniles after they'd left the colony. That was what dictated how the population changed. At that point, I realised that we now understood how the Skomer guillemot population worked. That left me in a dilemma. Part of me was extremely reluctant just to give up, but the lack of funding did make me wonder whether I shouldn't just throw the laptop in the sea and move on to something else. And somebody at the university said to me, have you considered crowdfunding? And I was very skeptical because at that stage crowdfunding was new, and I found it hard to imagine why anybody would want to give any money to a long-term project of guillemots. And then something extraordinary happened. The journal Nature got in touch with me and asked me if I would write something about long-term studies, their value, and the difficulty that came with trying to fund those projects.
It was the equivalent of something like getting an article into the New York Times. And I realised that this could launch a crowdfunding project. And I remember once you'd set it up, there was an option in the form that said, do you want to be informed when somebody's made a donation? So without thinking, I ticked the box. A couple of days later, it was launched, and my computer never stopped buzzing. It was just absolutely exhilarating. And there are two main things that would help this study continue. One is a person that is committed to the study and will help to make sure that it happens every year. And obviously we need funds. I've been pretty successful with the crowdfunding that's kept the study going at a good level for the last 10 years, but I'd like to see it go on for another 50 years. My wish always was that numbers here would recover to what they had been in the 1930s. That is, a population of about 100,000. I'm less certain about whether we would ever reach 100,000 pairs now because of climate change and bird flu. So many bird populations have undergone massive declines in the last few decades. 2023 was a disastrous year in many respects for the guillemot study, because no sooner had the breeding season ended than huge numbers of dead guillemots were washing up on beaches. And it quickly became apparent that there had been a major outbreak of bird flu. By looking at our ring birds in 2024, we were able to see that between 20 and 30% of them had almost certainly died, and almost certainly as a result of the previous year's bird flu. If we're ever going to challenge bird flu or climate change or any of these other threats, you have to know your study species extremely well. And so that's what this study has done. It's given us much better insight into the way the population works and how they respond to these perturbations and whether they're ever likely to recover. In some ways, I've known those birds on the ledges for 40-odd years. To see them just wiped out just makes me desperately sad. At the same time, as a scientist, I want to understand what's going on. I want to understand how we monitor things so that we can document what's going on, because without that documentation, we have no ammunition to fight these various causes that are depressing seabird populations. Because I did so much painting as a teenager, it was an important part of my life, and it now helps to fulfill a certain desire. I like the feel of the brush and the paint on the card that I'm painting on, and it's just deeply satisfying. I lose myself, I can forget time when I'm doing that. So I've kind of drawn from the surrealistic tradition. So I want to introduce something else, some symbolism, some kind of deeper meaning, that when people look at the paintings that I've done, it makes them think. Many animals feature in apocalyptic paintings, but birds are the most frequent, precisely because they held such a special place in the medieval mind, as they had done for millennia. Hovering midway between heaven and earth, half angels, half animals, the birds were the ultimate messengers, linking the present to the afterlife. In apocalyptic images, priests are preaching to the birds and effectively asking, what have they done to the earth? What have we done to the earth?